Welcome to LV Scary Stories, where the wilderness holds more than just animals in its shadows. In this video, we bring you 5 spine-chilling hunting stories that blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. From eerie encounters in dense forests to the unexplainable stalking hunters at night. These tales will make you think twice about venturing into the wild. So, grab your gear, turn off the lights, and prepare for these haunting hunting tales that will keep you up long after the campfire dies out. Story number 1. It was 1991 when my family moved to Alaska. I remember we lived in a house owned by a family who didn't live far from us. They owned a large piece of land that included a small lake. We never found out exactly what ethnicity they were, but they were very kind. They would always bring us gifts during Christmas. I loved living there because we could hunt and fish on their property. The lake behind their house was shallow, perfect for fishing. By 1997, I was 13 years old and obsessed with exploring the area around the lake. One day, I went out hunting with my small rifle, walking the entire perimeter of the lake. On my way back, the lake was on my right, and the dense forest stretched out on my left. Up ahead, I noticed something red under a tree. I didn't remember seeing it earlier, which struck me as strange. As I got closer, I realized someone was sitting on a rock beneath the tree, dressed entirely in red. When I finally approached and turned to look, I froze. It was an old, bald man, clearly dead. His skin was dried out, stretched tight like plastic. His lips were white and cracked, stuck together, and his eyes were closed. He leaned against the tree, motionless. Panic surged through me, and I ran home as fast as I could. When I got home, I broke down crying and told my parents what I had seen. My older brother, who was 17 at the time and spoke good English, called our landlord Mark to tell him what had happened. My brother explained to Mark that someone had left a dead body on his property. 20 minutes later, Mark arrived at our house. He brought a photo album with him. After speaking with my dad and brother, Mark opened the album, flipping through its pages until he stopped at one. He asked me if the man in the photo was the person I had seen. I leaned in to look, and my stomach dropped. It was the same old man. He was even wearing the same red clothes. But the most chilling part? In the photo, he was already dead. Next to him in the picture was an old woman. Mark then told us the story of his grandmother. She had been married to a white man and had come to the U.S. in the 1950s. Her marriage to the white man was arranged. She and her real husband back home had agreed to it so she could send money to her family overseas. The land they owned had originally belonged to the white man. After his death, the land passed to Mark's grandmother. Though Mark's family had converted to Christianity in 1984, his grandmother had continued practicing the traditional religion of their homeland. After her husband's death, she would dig up his body every year on his birthday. She'd dress him in red, bring him home for a few days, and then rebury him. She kept up this ritual until her own death in the 1980s. Mark explained that when his grandmother passed away, they buried her and her white husband together. But when the family converted to Christianity, they built the lake directly over the two graves. As Mark finished the story, he added one last thing. Today is actually his birthday. That might be why you saw him. Story number 2. Here in Alaska, hunters often use thermoscopes. For those who don't know, a thermoscope is a device that detects heat, especially useful at night when it's cold. Back in the day, thermoscopes were very expensive, costing thousands of dollars, but I saved up and got one for my rifle. One day, my 3 friends and I decided to go hunting for big game during moose season. Kevin volunteered to drive his big pickup truck. We packed our gear and supplies, since we planned to stay out for 2 or 3 days. The road to the hunting site was a narrow dirt path winding through the mountains. Some areas were especially dangerous, with only enough room for one vehicle. If another car came along, one of us would have to reverse until there was enough space to pass. A single mistake could mean tumbling down the mountain to your death, but for many hunters, the thrill of the hunt outweighs any fear of danger. When we arrived, Kevin drove to the other side of the hill, away from a moose carcass we had passed earlier. The animal looked like it had been dead for at least a week, but the cold weather had slowed its decomposition. We found a good spot to set up camp and pitched a large tent meant for 8 people, even though there were only 4 of us. Afterward, we explored the area for tracks and signs of wildlife. The terrain looked promising, with some older tracks indicating the presence of game. That evening, as we ate dinner, one of our friends performed a spiritual ritual, asking the spirits of the mountains for protection and blessings for the hunt. As night fell, we prepared to settle in. Kevin stepped outside to relieve himself by a tree stump. We could hear wolves howling in the distance, and Kevin couldn't resist howling back. We laughed but warned him to stop messing around. We didn't want wolves near our camp. Later that night, we were chatting in the tent. I attached my thermoscope to my rifle and decided to scan the surroundings. The wolves continued to howl in the distance. I opened one side of the tent and looked around. When I aimed my scope at the area where we had seen the moose carcass, I spotted a large heat signature. It looked like a massive wolf, likely a gray wolf given its size. It was sniffing around the carcass. I scanned the rest of the area but didn't see much else. That night we heard sticks breaking and footsteps near our campsite. Probably nocturnal animals, or so we thought. The next day, we split into pairs to hunt. Kevin and I returned to where the carcass had been. I told him about the wolf I'd seen through my thermoscope the night before. However, we didn't find any wolf tracks. Instead, we found what looked like human footprints, barefoot and oddly shaped. We assumed someone might have stopped by out of curiosity, but we didn't dwell on it. After several hours, we regrouped back at camp. That night around 10 p.m., Kevin started complaining about pain in his right abdomen. At first it seemed mild, but by 11 p.m. the pain had intensified to an 8 out of 10. Kevin was moaning with every movement. One of our friends, a medical assistant, suspected appendicitis, but the pain moved from his right side to his left, then back again, which didn't fit the symptoms. By this point, Kevin was in agony. We debated driving back on the dangerous mountain roads or waiting until dawn. I decided to check the first aid kit in the truck for painkillers. As soon as I stepped out of the tent, I was hit by an overpowering stench of rot. The smell hadn't been there before, and I felt as though something was watching me. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. I grabbed the first aid kit, though it only had Benadryl, no Tylenol or ibuprofen. As I returned to the tent, the sense of being watched intensified. Inside the tent, Kevin's pain seemed unnatural, as if it were caused by something other than illness. I picked up my rifle and thermoscope, determined to investigate. Looking through the scope, I saw something at the 3 o'clock position near the edge of the forest. It was sitting like a dog, watching our tent. The creature didn't seem to know I could see it. I flipped the safety off my rifle and took aim. My friends asked what I was doing, but I didn't answer. I fired. The creature shot up, running on 2 legs like a human. I fired again as it fled into the woods. When I looked through the thermoscope, I could see a trail of warm blood where I had hit it. Kevin's pain immediately subsided after I shot the creature. Everyone was scared after I told them what I saw and why I've decided to shoot it earlier. We spent the night in the pickup truck instead of in our tent that night. The next morning, we investigated. We found dried blood where I had shot the creature, and disturbingly, the moose carcass had been moved to our campsite. How it got there from the other side of the hill was a mystery. We packed up and left immediately. On the way back, the original carcass was gone, confirming our suspicion that it was the same one now near our camp. We've concluded that something might have wore the moose carcass to our campsite. It's probably that creature that I've shot. A few nights later, after we returned home, I stepped outside to take out the trash and smelled the same putrid stench. I felt the same eerie sensation of being watched. Over the following nights, my wife and I would hear faint knocking at our doors and windows, as if something was trying to get in. We lived in the countryside, with the nearest house 2 miles away. I began to believe the creature had followed me home. Eventually, we moved to Minnesota, and the disturbances stopped. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those mountains, but I suspect it was a skinwalker. Alaska is beautiful but full of mysteries. If you're out hunting, stay vigilant. You never know what might be out there. Story number 3. We live in Texas, and the event I'm about to share happened in 2007. For those of you familiar with Texas, you know it's home to the most wild hogs in the U.S. You can hunt wild boars year-round, with no bag limit. One time, my brother and I went hog hunting at night. For those who don't know, even though hunting hogs at night is allowed, it's a good idea to notify your game warden beforehand. My brother and I arrived just as the sun was setting. Sunset is one of the best times to hunt hogs. Over the years, they've adapted and become incredibly smart. They've learned that humans usually hunt during the day, so now they mostly come out at night to forage for food. That evening, my brother and I hunted together. The sun had just set, but there was still enough light to see a short distance. We usually hunt during this time, and if we don't get a shot, we sleep in the truck and get up early to try again. Hunting at night can be risky. You could easily get lost. We followed our usual route, searching for hogs. At one point, we came across a tree with bones scattered underneath it, which looked like deer bones. The forest around us grew eerily quiet. When we reached a small stream where we often spot wild hogs, even the stream's flow seemed unnaturally smooth and silent. The stillness made the night feel unsettling. After a while, my brother turned to me and said, "We should head back." This caught me off guard. Usually I'm the one who wants to call it quits first, but hearing him suggest it made me feel even more uneasy. Something about that night didn't feel right, and the fact that he felt the same way only made it worse. As we walked back, we heard footsteps following us. Each time we turned around and shone our lights, nothing was there. I whispered to my brother, "Maybe it's a cougar stalking us," but he shook his head. "Cougars don't make noises like that," he said. The closer we got to the truck, the less dense the forest became. Yet, the footsteps continued. We turned back again with our flashlights, and this time saw a deer following us. It was a female deer standing a fair distance away. We both sighed in relief. "It's just a deer," I said, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But as we reached the tree where we had first spotted the deer bones, the deer was no longer following us. When we finally got back to my truck, we decided to snack a little and then try to sleep inside. I reclined the driver's seat and trying to get some rest. My brother did the same. Around 11 p.m., my brother said he needed to step out to take a leak. I stayed in the truck, watching him through the window as he stood outside, shining his flashlight toward the right side of the forest. Suddenly, I noticed him freeze. He slowly reached for his handgun and aimed it in the direction of his flashlight beam. Then, he turned to look at me inside the truck before looking back at whatever he saw. Without warning, he fired 2 shots. He then walked to the back of the truck, aimed again, and fired 2 more times into the bushes. He climbed back into the truck, his face pale. "We need to go. Now," he said. I didn't ask any questions. I started the truck and drove. It was dark and dangerous navigating the forest roads at night, but my brother didn't want to stay there a second longer. When we finally reached the main road, he told me what had happened. "When I was looking to the right," he began, "I saw a shadow standing there. I flashed my light at it, and it looked like you." "What?" I asked, stunned. "It looked exactly like you," he said, "but your face was covered in boils, and you were smiling at me. Then I looked back at the truck and saw you still inside. That's when I shot at it. It ran into the bushes, so I fired 2 more times at the spot where it disappeared." In my culture and religious beliefs, when we encounter things like this, we must seek out a spiritual healer for help and guidance. Sometimes, encountering spirits like this can make you sick and even lead to death. That weekend, we asked our grandpa, who is a spiritual healer, to perform a ritual. Afterward, he told us that someone had recently tortured a deer in that area and left it to die under a tree. The spirit of the deer was still restless, searching for the person who had caused its suffering. Grandpa explained that the spirit had followed us and even morphed into something resembling me. That's when we remembered the deer bones under the tree. We haven't hunted in that area since. Story number 4. It was 2011 in Montana. My friend George had been bugging me for 2 weeks to go hunting with him. I used to go hunting with him regularly over the past 2 years, but ever since I started dating, I stopped. This time he was determined to convince me. I finally agreed, and on the way to our usual spot, we were joking around in the car. George laughed and said, "If you keep putting hoes before bros, I'm going to tell your girlfriend you've got gray hairs on your balls." We both cracked up, and the morning seemed like it would be just another hunt. George's uncle had a huge property spanning 3 hills, and it was our usual hunting spot. I typically stayed in one tree stand, while George preferred to roam around. We arrived at his uncle's land early in the morning, while it was still pitch black. I headed to my usual tree stand, which was thankfully still intact, and climbed up. George hiked over 2 hills to his spot. We carried radios, but only used them if absolutely necessary. By 5 a.m. I was settled in, bundled up in my oversized jacket and keeping warm. As dawn broke, I heard a gunshot echo from the direction George had gone. It was only 1 shot, so I assumed he'd hit his target. I waited to hear from him over the radio. About 20 minutes later, I heard something moving toward me. I looked to the east and saw a deer walking in my direction. It was a beauty, big antlers and everything. I slowly raised my rifle and took a closer look through the scope. Yep, definitely a deer. It kept walking directly toward me, completely unaware of my presence. I waited for the perfect moment, took aim, and fired. The deer disappeared behind a nearby tree. I quickly repositioned myself and fired again, aiming for where it had hidden. Then I heard George shout, "Hey, don't shoot! It's me! It's just me!" Heart pounding, I lowered my rifle and yelled back, "What? It's you! Get out of there! You look just like a deer! Get out!" Silence. I waited for George to come out from behind the tree, but nothing happened. Then, my radio buzzed. "Did you get it? Were those 2 shots yours?" George asked. Confused and shaken, I responded, "Are you hiding behind a tree? I just shot at you thinking you were a deer." "No," he said. "I'm still gutting the deer I shot earlier. I heard the shots and just wanted to check if it was you." My heart dropped. I looked back at the tree where I'd seen the deer, or George, or whatever it was, and nothing was there. My hands were trembling. I needed to be sure. Over the radio, I asked, "George, do you remember what you said about my balls this morning?" George laughed. "Yeah, I said I was going to tell your girlfriend you've got gray hairs on them. Relieved, I realized this was the real George on the radio, but I was too scared to climb down from the tree stand. I told him, I'm staying up here. Something happened, and I'm not coming down until you get here. About 30 minutes later, George showed up. I climbed down, still shaken. He asked me what happened, but I told him I'd explain it on the drive home. We went back to retrieve his deer and headed home with the meat. On the way back, I told him everything. George believed me. He explained that his uncle's land was rumored to have some Native American graves on its outskirts, and that the land itself might be haunted. I still don't know what I encountered that morning. Could it have been a Wendigo? A skinwalker? I have no idea. What I do know is that ever since that day, we've never hunted alone on his uncle's land. Story number 5. I live in Arizona and love hunting. My friend Joseph knows a native man named Ahiga, who owns a large piece of land that very few people know about. Joseph has hunted on Ahiga's land several times and has brought home plenty of meat. Ahiga charges a small fee for access to his property. Occasionally, Joseph camps on Ahiga's land. Joseph has always said that Ahiga is a kind old man who lives alone. One day, Joseph asked if I wanted to hunt on Ahiga's land. I told him I'd been waiting for him to invite me. When we arrived, we met Ahiga at his house, paid him, and parked on his property. While we chatted, I jokingly asked, "Are there any skinwalkers on your land?" Ahiga didn't respond. He just looked at us, his face unreadable, and said, "Good luck." Then we headed into the woods behind his house. At the time, I didn't know that natives don't talk about things like skinwalkers. You're not supposed to mention them because you don't know who might be one. If you speak of them, it's said they'll come for you. Our plan was to hunt separately, and if either of us ran into trouble, we'd fire 3 shots as a signal. I had my handgun with me but preferred hunting with a bow and arrow. Those of you who hunt with a bow know there's nothing more satisfying than taking down prey with an arrow. After we split up, I wandered into a part of the woods that felt strange. There were sticks tied together and hung from trees, almost like some kind of ritual. A little farther ahead, I saw a massive deer with large, impressive antlers. It was lying on the ground, its stomach sliced open, with its organs and intestines completely removed. The deer looked fresh, and the sight of it sent chills down my spine. I started to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the deer. When I was a safe distance away, I turned to walk away, but then I heard something fall behind me. I turned back and saw that the deer had collapsed onto the ground. As I stared, I realized the deer was moving. It rose to its feet, first on all 4s, and stared at me. My blood ran cold. This deer had no organs. How was it alive? Then, to my horror, it stood up on its hind legs, like a human, and began running straight at me. I fired an arrow, then turned and ran as fast as I could. While running, I pulled out my handgun, turned, and fired 3 shots. I didn't know if I hit it or not, but I kept running. When I looked back, it was gone. My heart was pounding when I heard a single gunshot from my friend Joseph's direction. I fired a single shot into the sky to signal where I was, and within 10 minutes, Joseph found me. I was trembling, but I didn't tell him what had happened. We decided to end the hunt early and head back. When we returned to Ahiga's house, we were shocked to see police cars and an ambulance outside. 4 officers approached us and asked if we had seen any other hunters. We told them we hadn't. The officers explained that someone had shot an arrow at Ahiga while Ahiga was out on his porch, hitting him in the leg. As we stood there, we saw paramedics wheeling Ahiga out on a stretcher, the arrow still lodged in his leg. The officers noticed my bow and arrows and said they needed to take us in for questioning. But just then, Ahiga lifted his head and asked if we were okay. Joseph said we were fine and asked about him. Ahiga assured us he would be all right. The paramedics loaded Ahiga into the ambulance, but before they drove off, I saw the arrow in his leg. It was black with 2 red markings near the tail, just like the arrows I carried. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.